You're still.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. This came a bit of it's a surprise that fast and that quick, but thank you. So I've been working on labor and with labor on workers takeovers of factories for workers control production and on different kinds of new forms of workers resistance. I've been doing this on a scholarly way as an activist, and I studied my first PhD with 40 something because I've been an activist in different movements before that. And what I studied mainly was like in Latin America and in Southern Europe. So this is like the more or less where I'm coming from. I don't know. I guess we should maybe first do a round of introduction, right? Or what was your idea?
So I can open up the floor. I think we're still waiting for Alex. She should join us like any moment. But yeah, if you want to just give an introduction to, I guess, yourself and your history with RLS, maybe a little bit, just to give the audience an idea of our previous partnership. And then I can like sort of start the questions to guide the conversation.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I just thought we might maybe like make a little like presentation round first so that I know who else is on. So I've been with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation lately. I've published like 2 years ago, yes, a book which is available for free download in English and German on workers organizations, workers groups against fascism, authoritarianism, racism, etc. So looking at workers' organization as something that is much more than just about income or something, but like it's a different idea of the world and what role they played in all kinds of movements all around the globe. And the second thing I did like recently for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is a study on sustainable work and just transition, looking at a few European countries, but also at the Philippines, Mexico, and Colombia. So the idea there is that because we always talk about sustainability, but not about work. So how about if we say, okay, every work should be sustainable and check for that. And maybe also to make that clear for like the discussion that will follow, the work, I think we should like understand all kinds of work. So paid and unpaid work, the supposed productive and reproductive work, which is a distinction I don't think makes any sense, but it's there. We have to think about all these and also think class as more than just the workplace. Class is the communities that live in a certain way and live together, struggle together. So I think that like class is not just a place in the production, but is coming through struggle. So the class only exists in struggle. So it's, yeah, maybe a short introduction. Sorry if I was too loud.
No, it's perfect. And just to introduce the audience to Michelle Zhong Chen from Cornell University, a journalist by trade.
Journalist by trade, maybe an academic by training for now.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Awesome. And can you just introduce like what you cover in your work as well?
Sure. Right now, the reason I'm at Cornell is because I have a postdoc in labor history at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. So that is kind of a temporary respite, perhaps a permanent one from being an underpaid journalist, being a precariously employed academic, at least for now. But prior to this, I wrote for publications like The Nation and Dissent in these times about primarily about Well, primarily about labor and migration issues, and also, about civil rights and social policy, and in some ways about how technology and technological change kind of intersects with those. That also intersects a little bit with some of my academic work, but I started covering I guess I became interested in migration back right after college. I did a Fulbright in China looking at internal migration in China and sort of the social and cultural impacts of migration from rural areas to urban centers within China. And that was sort of interesting for someone who is primarily grew up in the US and is used to thinking about migration in a sort of transnational global perspective, and looking at how sort of human movement and demographic change can lead to profound social and economic changes both within countries and across regions is something that's kind of a through line in what I write about academically. My dissertation research, which I'm trying to turn into a manuscript right now, was focused on deportation resistance among trade unionists and activists on the labor left in the 1950s during the McCarthy era in the US. So that's definitely sort of looking at a period that's quite a bit in the past compared to what I wrote about as a journalist, but it is interesting to take a historical perspective on some of these issues and see how trends tend to persist over time, and we're still grappling with the same questions about dealing with the question of borders and the meaning of borders and citizenship, civil rights, economic citizenship, and labor rights. I also do a couple of occasional podcasts. I do one on labor called Belabored. It's with Dissent magazine, and I have done I have done a podcast / radio program on Asian America and Asian American politics and culture since around 2010. And actually, I first started working, the first thing I did with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation actually was I did a panel on community radio and grassroots radio and activism at the World Social Forum in Montreal. So that was kind of my introduction to RLF, and that was really cool. So in addition to labor, I'm also sort of interested in how the media can influence social movements and vice versa.
That's awesome. And I guess just to briefly introduce, Alex Press. Alex is a staff writer at Jacobin who covers labor movements around the country. So Alex, you want to just say a few words on what you've been working on recently this year?
Yeah, I've been working on being everywhere in the United States where there are strikes, which usually is a slow beat. These days has not so much been slow. So I mean, in a sort of overview, I've been covering the UAW's rebirth and then the big three auto strike. I covered, out in Hollywood, the actors and the writers striking. There have been strikes that didn't get as much attention, but I think are really interesting, like theoretically and politically. I went out to just outside of Erie, Pennsylvania, where a bunch of locomotive manufacturing workers struck a plant, and their demands were around kind of taking back control of the shop floor in the realm of being able to strike over grievances. There was new management bought the plant and was violating their contracts. They also want green locomotives. So I thought it was really interesting compared to kind of caricatures of the Rust Belt, fairly white working class. These were like fairly radical demands. There are many other things we could talk about, I guess, just by way of to follow Michelle, just kind of like what else I'm up to. I also have hosted some podcasts of labor history. I did one with the historian Gabriel Winant, where we went through the making of the English working class, the E.P. Thompson tome. And we have another one in the works with a couple other historians and kind of organizers. It's a good group called The Fragile Juggernaut, which is about the CIO's history. And then I also just wrapped helping with a documentary about the Amazon Labor Union, which I also have covered very closely because it's in my neighborhood. In Staten Island, New York City, they unionized that house. which was only the start of their problems. You know, getting a contract at Amazon is very hard. So that'll be premiering at Sundance next month. So I'm really anything to do with US labor, whether it's new organizing, whether it's old organizing and strikes, you know, that's pretty much my beat.
That's awesome. And yeah, definitely seen your work very prominently, very recently, over the last course of I guess since the strikes started, all these big strikes started. So you've been covering them with great detail, and we really appreciate that and you joining us here. I guess just to kick off the conversation, maybe we'll start with Dario again. So Article 23 in the Universal Human Rights Declaration is the right to work. So that might mean something very different today, especially in the American context, than what was originally meant when this declaration was signed back in 48. So I guess, Dario, the question for you is like, what is the relevance to the right to work today for humans around the world? Oh, you're still muted.
Yeah, I think that the main problem is that, first of all, I mean, the right to work is not respected. So that people, I mean, there are people that don't have work, which wouldn't be a problem if you still can make a living. Yes. So the problem is the connection between work and make a living. So which starts to be something which is already fundamental against the Declaration of Human Rights. So, I mean, the interesting thing about this declaration is that most of it, you can say, it's not valid on the workplace. There are no human rights on the workplace. There's no free speech. There's no free movement. There's nothing of all that. So that's something I think that even related to 23, which is about work, we also have the problem that there are people that work and still cannot make a living. Yes, and not just in the global south where this is very common, but even like in the global north, and especially like in the US, which is kind of most of it should be considered part of the global south, looking at the conditions workers and working class families have in the US. So I think that it is interesting that these rights we're not even any closer to these to realize these rights. I would think that the main problem is that it's not even something that is a subject of discussion. So that the workplace is an extra legal zone that does not comply neither with the universal human rights, nor with like civil rights, nor with anything, is not only something that is accepted, it's legalized this way. So we can say that this, and I think we should always be clear about the fact that work has, like work in how we know it in our capitalist societies, is something that's been created in an extra legal space. Yes, so this is like the I think the basic point where we have to start and not think we're thankful for work or whatever, but it's like they created an extra legal space where human rights don't count. So what is the meaning of this today, or what is the importance of the Human Rights Declaration? Obviously, it's the importance of showing that these are rights that everyone has. And I think this is very important because there are like many more, like, for example, the right also, to join trade unions for protection of interests. Doesn't exist in the US, the right. I mean, you can join it, but then you lose your job or you don't have a union on the job. I mean, that's the reality. So I think it's important kind of signal as making clear these are fundamental rights. Yes, and there was a time where governments even recognized that. It was like the shock of the Second World War, blah, blah, blah. Most countries wouldn't sign that today again, and the US probably not for sure. So countries signed that, and it's important to be always aware these are basic rights. So at the moment, we're not fighting, not even for basic rights in our workplaces. Yes, we're like people are fighting to not to be able to make a living, or to not work under completely brutal conditions, but like we're at the moment, we're not even at the point to fight for the realization of universal human rights at work, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think this idea of the workplace being an extra legal space is very sort of relevant today with what you're seeing with different people being videotaped at marches or filmed doing actions in the streets, and then calls for this person to lose their job with the idea that this person was out in the public, but they're somehow representing the private when they're in the public and doing these actions. So it's very interesting, a very, very interesting theory or reality that we're living in with this idea of an extra legal workspace that, oh, by the way, everybody needs to participate in, because you really can't make a living outside of the workspace unless you're an entrepreneur of great success, I guess. But I guess, Michelle, same question to you. Like, so what would you say? What would you say is the sort of importance or the relevance of this Declaration of Right to Work that you've seen just abroad or throughout the world?
Yeah, I think I generally, unfortunately, I do agree somewhat with Dario about how the so-called right to work, or at least you know, the spirit of that provision is generally more honored in the breach than in actuality today. But I guess, I mean, I think the problem is not so much you know, the right to work per se. It's more about the right to, you know, the right to decent work, the right to, you know, a humane workplace, the right to basic health and safety protections on the job, so that, you know, you don't die while doing that work. I mean, I think it's probably not a coincidence that the phrase "right to work" has been co-opted by the right in the United States anyway, to become the basic shorthand for kind of one of the principal policy horses of the right in terms of pushing anti-union policy, because right to work laws, which are spread throughout about half the country in terms of states, are essentially there to undermine unions. And the phrase "the right to work" has kind of been used to suggest that any kind of labor protection is essentially undermining people's access to work, or undermining people's sort of freedom to work, right? And of course, the labor movement often counters with, you know, right to work laws being sort of the right to work for less, right? So I just think taking that one small example of how even the wording of the right to work has kind of been manipulated and co-opted by various sort of ideological debates around labor rights, kind of points to kind of a profound disconnect that we're experiencing between this idea that work is somehow fundamentally a good thing or a vital thing, and the fact that people today, particularly in the United States, I think you know, this may play out culturally differently in a place like Europe, for instance, but I think this idea that you know, work is a vital part of being a productive citizen, or that your life should somehow be measured in how productive you are, or the type of economic contribution you make, that can often be used to sort of obscure the fundamental question of the quality of that work, what work displaces in the rest of your life, whether or not we put too much emphasis on simply the fact that people are working without really recognizing or looking at the other types of rights that may actually be impeded or undermined, or even totally obliterated as a result of being essentially kind of coerced into a work situation that doesn't respect other fundamental human rights. So I think the workplace, in terms of being sort of an extra legal or an extra constitutional zone, I think that kind of speaks to the fact that the right of capital and property rights often take precedence in our society anyway, in the US, over labor rights. And I think it's also interesting to think about this question of the right to work and whether or not work is something that everyone should feel entitled to or should feel some sort of moral claim to, because we're sort of verging on a society in which work as such, or the idea of working 40 hours a week, or the idea of having, one job or one career for the rest of your life, is possibly becoming increasingly obsolete, or we're having to sort of fundamentally rethink the role of work in society. Are we going to have technologies that displace workers to the extent that people will face a situation in which their jobs are basically rendered no longer necessary for, the perpetuation of industrial capitalism. And when we do come up on a situation like that, then what would something like the right to work mean in a society where, we have the means and the technology to let everyone work less, or let some people sort of not do waged labor at all. And, maybe we should be thinking about a right not to work, or a right to sort of opt out of the necessity for work. And so I think that that's the sort of more sort of philosophical, like existential question that we're coming up on when we think about the future of work. That's a very vogue term these days. But when we think about historically how much of our sense of self and how much of our sense of identity has been bound up in our participation in the workforce, that's a relatively small slice of human history. So maybe we need to sort of rethink the role of labor and whether or not it really deserves the outsized importance that it currently takes in our society. And maybe we can think about ways to take care of ourselves and each other that don't necessarily involve subjecting yourself to the whims of an employer for 40, 50, 60 hours a week. So yeah, maybe that's just a question to put out there as we think about it. That being said, I also think that the workplace and the labor movement are also historically and also in the present, extremely important sites of contesting rights and exercising political power and building leverage for people who don't have very much power or influence in society. And so I guess ultimately, I hope that, the labor movement can sort of reconcile this idea of, work perhaps being too necessary or too much of a coercive force in our lives, and also, seeking and also looking at work as potentially a platform for some kind of economic or social emancipation for some people. So.
Sure, yeah, I definitely think there's like a Protestant work ethic that will remain in the current of this country for quite some time, but hopefully we can sort of chip away at it. Hopefully these unions can sort of chip away at that in fighting for their own rights and better working conditions for themselves. So maybe I'll throw it to Alex with that question. Is essentially, is there any relevance to the right to work today? Obviously, it has like a perversion coming from the rights when they talk about the right to work, and depends on which state you're in. There might be right to work laws on the books that don't necessarily give you the right to work for a meaningful wage and in good condition. So yeah, just throw it to you with that question of what is the relevance today? What does that mean for workers?
Yeah. So I had a few thoughts from both Dario and Michelle's comments as well. Though I was just in response to your immediate question, I was thinking I saw Scott Walker, who was one of the great villains of the recent American labor movement. He attacked unions in Wisconsin as governor. Really a great villain, and the right to work, as the phrase it's used on the right, like Scott Walker is one of the predominant people. And I was just noticing that yesterday he had tweeted last night, collective bargaining is not a right. It's an expensive entitlement. I'm like, did he know this was the topic of the conversation tonight? Wow, great kicking off point, that this remains a real live debate. I think before I talk a little bit about like the unions and the right to work, I just, looking over the declaration before this event, I was really struck by like Article 24, right? Right to leisure and rest, and what Michelle especially was just saying about the right not to work. I think it's really interesting in that, especially over the pandemic, this has become quite a live topic of discussion and like a motivating factor in many strikes and near strikes among the US working class, which right is famously not thought of as particularly motivated. People talk about the Protestant work ethic and this kind of digging deep into identity around wanting to work. The pandemic actually led to so many people being moved to strike over mandatory overtime and horrible scheduling practices. And really the question of hours and scheduling became like the central conversation in a way that, of course, it had been when the US labor movement was originally built, which was around, of course, the 8-hour struggle. And so it's been really interesting to see this, like, might have previously been sort of dismissed as like utopian or more philosophical questions around rest and not working. In fact, you're hearing like the loudest labor leaders as well as the rank and file kind of voicing this desire. And so a quote came to mind that the newly elected president of the UAW, Shawn Fain, said a couple weeks ago, I was talking to him, interviewing him about like this crazy year that his union especially has had. And I was like, why the residents? Why are people really like supporting auto workers during their strike and generally like this upsurge in public support for unions and striking? And he said that, sort of to chip it down to a couple lines, he said, what's important in life isn't working 7 days a week, 12 or 16 hours a day, or working multiple jobs just to survive. The pandemic, COVID made us reconsider those things. And we realized that what's important is people want to live. And I feel that kind of sums up this like getting down to the point of things. I also just this week was talking to a great 30-year Teamster member, UPS worker in New York City. And he had said, he similarly was trying to understand why this uptick in fighting and winning by unions in the United States. He was like, people are on the streets, they're struggling, they're working their knuckles to the bone, and they're saying, for what? Nothing. I'm killing myself. It's not just 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. Now it's Tuesday to Saturday, and also I'm working Sundays. What happened to the Haymarket Square fight? What happened to 8 hours of rest and 8 hours of sleep? And so where did that go? And so it's like really these conversations are quite lively and like happening on the shop floor, like references to Haymarket Square and the fight for these basic rights, in a way that I find, it's hopeful. That people are really having these debates, not just in conversations like this, but actually on the picket line as well. And so, I mean, as far as the right to work being substantive, I mean, I agree with what Dario said at the jump, that like these rights don't apply. They have not been applied in the US workplace, especially. I can't speak as much to other places, but it makes me think of Elizabeth Anderson's book, Private Government, which, I think the maybe subtitle is like How Employers Rule Our Lives and We Don't Talk About It or something. And you check your rights at the door. No free speech, often legally protected rights for collective action and bargaining also are just violated systematically. There is still nothing that is done about it, even as in this country we have a more aggressive National Labor Relations Board now. They can't impose penalties on employers who violate workers' rights beyond, a couple $1,000s, and it's barely enforced. For an Amazon or a Starbucks, that's completely worth it to destroy a union and pay out some little fines here and there, or have to reinstate 1 or 2, militant workers in your giant workforce. It's nothing compared to winning against a union. And so I don't want to give too much of a pessimistic kind of take on making the right to work in Article 23 real in the United States. But I mean, just reading over it before this event, I was like, yeah, none of this is at all. These are all contested. In fact, much of the elected officials in this country would take great. They would be outraged at some of the lines in this article. It's completely not agreed upon as common sense, especially among like elected officials here.
Yeah, I think that's a really comprehensive, great answer. And I think I'll pivot with that answer, I guess, to Dario, is there any relevance, anything that workers can take from these articles, in the legal construct around them to sort of lobby for their own rights? Like, is this something that workers could use, given how it's, again, so contentious, like, at least as we're currently living, there's no government that's actually like trying to like uphold themselves to this, right? So is there any purpose in actually using the framework outlined in the right to work as some sort of bargaining tool, a cudgel to use against labor? Or I guess in this case, we don't have the ability to collectively bargain. Maybe you're lobbying at like the sort of governmental level. So is there anything that workers can take from this and sort of try and actualize?
I mean, that they can take something from this, definitely yes. That it makes any sense to lobby with it, no. So I think, I mean, like, workers' history is that you get what you fight for, not what you lobby for. So and if you're not ready to fight for it when you have it, they take it away again. So that just to be clear, I think what is important about that is the consciousness that it is a right, the consciousness that it means if this is a right and I don't have it in a factory, it means work is dictatorship. Yes, it means it's not democracy. It's an authoritarian, repressive regime installed in a democracy to press out the surplus value from workers and make their lives miserable. Yes, so this is what you can read. If you read that and you with the situation we have. So I think this is important, and it's important because if you realize that something is your right, you fight differently for it than you are going to neg or beg for. Yes, that's why I think it's important to realize, and most people don't realize that. I mean, we're still like, I mean, I think that the pandemic and the situation in the US changed a lot over the past few years. But I mean, in the US or wherever, most of the people still don't realize that, think that they have to be thankful if they find a job. They don't know the rights on the job. They don't know even this declaration. So it's important to like realize that, and then obviously organize and do something. So also to just to be clear, I don't know if we have an international audience, but like for example, in the union freedom index, it goes like from 1 to 5, the evaluation you can have. 1 is the best and 5 is the worst. So the US situation is 4. Yes. So it's like a bit away from North Korea to be like every pointed. Yes, very pointed. So and I think what does it mean in a situation and like a right to work? Well, if I look at it, for example, from the things that I've been studying, like the workplace takeovers that I've been studying in Latin America and in Europe and etc. Well, that's one thing. So the owner wants to close the factory and kick out the workers, and they take it. They take it, they occupy it, and they build a cooperative or something to continue the production. Sometimes they change the production. As soon as they can decide themselves, because they took the factory and they stand body by body against the repression, the whole situation changes. They start, like, you start discussing, why are you producing certain things? What are you going to produce? Suddenly the health of the workers and the families becomes important because they can do something about it and they can change something about it. If you're in a frame where you're only allowed to talk about $1 more or less every hour, well, you might not think about these things because it makes you feel bad, because you know they're killing you with the job, they're killing you with the things that they're producing, but you can't do anything about it. So it's interesting to see that when they occupy, when they take the right to work seriously, because this factory was built on our sweat, and you don't go away with the money and with the factory, and we're going to go and do something here. And then you realize that's the right to work. That's the right to work, to take it in your hands, to decide with your community what you're producing, what you need, and what you will be doing. And this means also that it becomes meaningful work, because do we want like the right to work? I mean, I agree with Michelle. And since we're like in a Rosa Luxemburg panel, there's a saying in Germany, you if work would have kept it for themselves. Yes, and that's it. I mean, it's so easy to understand what work today is. Most of the work is alienating, it's repressive. You wouldn't do it if it wouldn't be for the money you get and you need to live. Yeah, I mean, probably 95% of the jobs or even more are like that. So it means we have to get obviously to meaningful work, because the right to meaningful work, to decent work, if we want to, the ILO definition is, I think, still not precise enough, but and still oriented in the idea of growth, which will obviously not happen and it's not possible. But like the idea, obviously, of decent life, of decent work is important, because it's fulfilling work, because it's like work that allows human development. And then it makes sense that this should be the right we should be fighting for. And it means workers' control. It means control of the means of production by the people that work. And that's and it is something that is important in any sense. It's important for like the emancipation of working class people, working class communities. It's important for the global South. Like Walter Rodney said there will be no decolonization without workers' control. Workers' control of the means of production is an essential part of decolonization. Yes, and so I think that's the right to work. It's also the right to decide of the work. Then we're fine.
Thank you. That was a great answer. And I just want to ask maybe Michelle, like what do you think meaningful work looks like? Maybe like what kind of hours a person would spend throughout their course of their week working, or maybe it's not even under the idea of the traditional work week. Maybe this is something that's more like, what percentage of a person's life do you think would be like the best balance for both like making a living and actually being able to live that living that you're trying to create for yourself with your labor?
I think going back to the relevance of this, Universal Declaration of Human Rights and what it says about the right to work, and also what it says about the right to join a trade union and that sort of thing. I think it goes back to this. I mean, maybe the key takeaway from this document is the realization that, rights on paper fundamentally don't mean anything unless you actually have power to enforce them and realize them and implement them in a meaningful way in one's life. So I think that's to think about what a decent work week, or a decent sort of, the corporate term now is like work-life balance. I think we need to also realize, like, when we say right to work, or when we talk about work being an important part of our lives, what we actually, I mean, the main thing is that we think we have a right to certain things in life, and work becomes the means of obtaining those things. So if work becomes the fundamental barrier to the things that you should be entitled to as a human being, then there's a basic contradiction, right, in our system, in the sort of legal and social structure in which these rights are presented to ordinary people on a day-to-day basis. So I think, I think what we really need to think about is citizenship and personhood and sovereignty and choice, right? And autonomy, right? So going back to what Dario was saying about, workers' control, and, the ability to, control the means of production, or whatever sort of intellectual gloss you want to put on it. I think the main question that we need to be grappling with is how do people want to define, a meaningful, fulfilling life? And that's going to be different for everyone, right? And we need to build a society that respects and accommodates people's ability to create the life that they want, right? And if that means working 60 hours a week because you love, being a carpenter, or, you love running a restaurant, or, or you love taking care of children, or whatever, right? That should be respected. But if you decide that, you don't want to do wage labor, right? Like, there should also be a role in society for you, or there should also be a place in society for you. You shouldn't sort of be castigated as like, lazy ingrate because you simply don't want to comply, with the norms that we've constructed around a system that, you know, perpetuates capitalism and the growth of capital at the expense of other basic human rights and needs, right? So, yeah, so I guess like the sort of roundabout answer that I'm going to give is that I have a hard time thinking about, you know, a single framework for what, you know, a decent work or wage structure or anything like that would look like. But I do know that, you know, one of the reasons we have a labor movement is because before there were any laws protecting workers in the workplace, people organized and they managed to mobilize and obtain power within the workplace, and also, you know, more broadly in society, that would allow them to define for themselves, right, what they wanted their work day to look like. You know, not completely, of course, but before there was sort of this idea that there are rights that exist out there sort of in the abstract that we're entitled to, right? Or that are handed down by the state, right? People defined for themselves what they felt like they deserved, right? And there was an impulse towards basic human autonomy, right? You know, the idea of like 8 hours for what we will, right? I mean, there's never been a point in human history when people didn't have a sense of what they wanted to do with their lives other than work, right? And so we shouldn't lose sight of that. So long before there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? We had a basic sort of moral compass around what it means to have a meaningful life, right? And it's not the same for everyone, but if we can, and our society is much more complicated than it was sort of in the sort of pre-industrial capitalism days. But, you know, I teach labor history, and one of the interesting things this past semester when I was talking about, you know, the rise of the 8-hour day movement, and I showed them sort of that like triptych of like 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will. And I asked my students, you know, what do you think they meant by 8 hours for what we will? And, you know, there's like sort of silence for a long time in the room. And like people, it took, you know, students, some of whom had worked and some of whom hadn't, right? It took them a long time to sort of like get to sort of wrap their head around this idea that, you know, that people should think of that chunk of the day that you just have for yourself and for nobody else, right? Like that's also an entitlement. And I don't know that, I think we're sort of like losing the language for that. So when we go back to something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, like maybe it's important to recognize like, yes, it was this sort of like, you know, sort of this kind of liberal framework that was created without any real sense of actually redistributing power in society or economic wealth or anything like that. And there are profound blind spots in it, right? But there is this idea that, you know, that people should have the ability to define their lives. So I think that's an important takeaway for understanding the role of work, because we need to be able to think about ourselves and think about our lives beyond the workplace.
For sure. And I think the different groups that are trying to redefine what that is, at least in the US and the US labor movement, are all of these unions that are seeing huge increases in their growth and their density. But maybe Alex, can you tell us a little bit about like what they're defining as their sort of demands in the different labor movements? Maybe it's UAW versus like the SAG-AFTRA union. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a giant question, but just, you know, I really like what Dario said about like the right to decide as kind of something that, as we've been having this conversation, seems to like be a through line. The right to decide what counts as a meaningful workday for you or not. The right to decide, you know, in the UE fight I was talking about, that's the electrical workers, and they're the ones who struck that gigantic manufacturing facility in Erie, Pennsylvania. You know, they were, you know, the leadership of that union, which remains one of the only like kind of independent, more radical unions in the United States, and not coincidentally was also decimated by the McCarthyist anti-communist purge of the 20th century in the labor movement. You know, the president, Carl Rosen of UE, said to me, like, you know, one of the great tragedies of the McCarthy kind of purges is that the American labor movement gave up the fight over controlling conditions on the shop floor. So I think for some people, even if they don't phrase it that way, that is in fact, one way to think about, it's not plant takeovers like Dario might be covering in Latin America or in certain parts of Europe. But it nonetheless is this sort of reaffirmation of something that I think was lost for a while in this country, the idea that the worker knows best, and that the boss is there often to stop the worker from, sort of making use of their knowledge. And the boss is only interested in knowledge as a means of further consolidating his own control over the workforce, and making the processes in the plant more efficient, but not necessarily, efficiency defined as more profitable rather than, say, more sensible for environmental, equilibrium or for humane working conditions. So that is a big fight, and I think something that can apply elsewhere. I mean, you think about the UAW, and there it's like these auto workers, especially in the big three, the Detroit automakers, GM, Ford, and Stellantis, which was formerly like Chrysler. These auto workers, the UAW, for all its horrible corruption in the past, still had this status of every worker struck when they were told to strike. There's this like, sort of, it goes across the political spectrum. Everyone acknowledges that auto work is difficult and that those workers deserve a living wage. And so I think they kind of mobilized around that, and led by this guy, Shawn Fain, their new president, who kind of puts this into, I think, really like almost religious kind of tones about like, in announcing the strike, he said something like, I'm gonna butcher his wording, but something like, in the kingdom of God, there is no person who exploits his own community. In the kingdom of God, there is no person who destroys the environment. In the kingdom of God, there's no one person who can destroy the lives and bodies of all of his brothers and sisters. This is not the kingdom of God. It is hell. Like for the most powerful union in the United States historically, and kind of the most vaunted, to have the leader kind of putting this in such stark terms around like class warfare being back on the table, and the workers actually carrying this view that's not just their own members and themselves that they're fighting for, but in fact they are trying to put back on the table the idea of what is right and wrong, and how it is like systematically violated by capitalist exploitation. I think is like, it's huge. I agree with Dario's assessment that the US is a 4 on the scale. It's not good. But there is now this motion happening all across, not just auto work and not just one sector, but really across many different unions, and especially in the private sector, which of course is barely unionized at all in this country, in a way that I think is very powerful and has like, there's real opportunities there. We've seen it just this year, as you mentioned, and as I've kind of laid out, like I was watching this happen in all of these places, and the amount that people elsewhere are being inspired by these strikes and going and taking those tools back to either unionize their workplace or reform their union, or kind of like go out on the offensive against their bosses, I think is really remarkable, and something that like does put these bigger questions that we've been talking about, these ideas laid out in the universal human rights statement. Like, how do you make that real? We always say in the labor movement, like, okay, if you're negotiating and you say this is our bottom line on which we will not go lower, what if you're talking about wages, for example, well, that has to be backed up by actual, what do you mean that you're going to tell the boss that you won't go lower? It means you have to be ready to strike. And so I think people are starting to see, what does it mean to actually make these things real? And it means you have to be willing to fight. And of course, I think that is a very exciting conversation to be having. And I mean, and of course, it's like at times bizarre to hear it being said by, say, like screenwriters in Hollywood and actors, who are, becoming labor militants. I mean, one of the things about the entertainment industry unions in this country is that they've always been quite strong, and they've kind of taken this industry that, I think it's not controversial to say that Hollywood kind of like is kind of the ultra like supercharged version of everything that's bad, or that many of us would think is bad about the capitalist economy. This like scarcity and hierarchy and perceived zero-sum game where all your coworkers are actually your competition, and yet these unions exist, and every member has one vote. Doesn't matter if you're an A-lister or just scraping by as a background actor. And we kind of saw how that was used to then mobilize to kind of confront an industry that has used the pandemic to, I think, supercharge sort of certain trends in that industry that just like, make the whole pie smaller for the workers there, and also redistribute wealth up to the point that so many of these union members in Hollywood are working second and third jobs, and and also being threatened by AI and things. And so I think we're seeing the language of kind of more radical labor movements of history past, both in the US and globally. You're hearing it all the time now. I mean, it's not that everyone agrees. I mean, Dario said this, that many workers in this country, especially, still buy into the idea that they should be grateful to have a job, that they should be thankful for whatever they get from the boss. But you're starting to see that contested quite openly and aggressively. And I think that, I don't know, so I don't have like a totally coherent answer here, but I think these conversations are really traversing one sector or one union, and the unions really are talking to each other. I mean, I'm seeing it all the time that, the US working class has so long been fragmented, where you have like grad students and academics and they don't know any Teamsters or UPS drivers, and they don't know any actors in Hollywood. And now all of a sudden they're all at each other's rallies, and they're all walking the picket lines together. And I think that can add up to more than the sum of its parts. Something has to give as far as like the legal obstacles in the United States to winning unions, to like taking on the boss. But I think, as Michelle said, before the laws come, what happened was workers were already there and demanding things. And then the politicians catch up and they say, okay, fine, we'll institute an 8-hour day. I think one last thing I just want to throw out there, because it's a conversation I just had that I thought was like a really another angle on this whole general topic. I was talking to Sarah Nelson, who is the president of the American Flight Attendants Association, CWA. She's also just like she's become quite well known in the US labor movement as kind of the like leftmost voice, this kind of like more militant, more outspoken labor leader, which is, in the past couple of years becoming less uncommon, but certainly 5 years ago, she was like one of the few union presidents who would speak this way. And she said something to me that was like about the topic of the relation between like democracy in this country and workers' rights. And the way I think many of us on the left always talk about democracy in the United States is that it doesn't exist, right? It's not just that you leave your rights at the workplace and only do you get them back when you clock out, but you also don't have them in the rest of your life. You can vote and it doesn't change how elected officials actually end up, what laws they pass or don't pass, what interests that have already captured their vote and their priorities. And it leads to this like incredible despair, I think, and like, whether you want to call it nihilism, sometimes it leads to more radical views about like what these parties represent. But I think often it has just led to like this apathy. And so Sarah was talking to me about this, and she was saying, people, this is her quote that I just want to offer to the group. People supposedly participate in a democracy, and it doesn't seem to change because we're living in a system of capitalism and money is controlling our politics. People are looking at unions, though, and they're seeing changes in one day, in a week, in as short as 6 weeks, which she was referring to the UAW Big Three strike there. That's nothing compared to waiting for years and years and being frustrated that nothing changes. So people are seeing that regular people can take action together and they can get change fast that they would otherwise never have gotten. And, and she's talking about these UAW members who like, some of them had their pay double upon ratification of that contract. And they had, there's been a lot of, sort of, they didn't get everything they wanted around control over scheduling, but it's certainly an improvement. They got back certain things like stronger pensions and retirement, the cost of living adjustments that they'd given up when the auto companies went bankrupt during the Great Recession. And so it was this idea that like, and especially these communities that say in the sort of deindustrialized Rust Belt kind of Midwestern places, who are completely quote unquote like left behind, as lacking as that framework is, I think there's some truth to it. Suddenly they're like, oh, right, we can just leverage our power in the one place that it still exists, which is in fact the workplace. And that can force not only these wage changes and things like that, but you also saw political scrambling. I mean, Biden walked a picket line because the UAW is a key voter bloc and they hadn't endorsed him yet. And he didn't want to, he's looking at his reelection. And you see Donald Trump even immediately show up in Detroit to pretend to speak to striking auto workers. It was a farce. He was invited by the boss of an auto plant. And yet, nonetheless, he too was like, I got to be seen as having done the right thing by these workers, even though that was a complete lie. I mean, it really is this interesting thing where it's like, oh, there's one way I can get the president to show up, in my community. It's by shutting down my auto plant. And I think that is like, again, you don't know what conclusions that will lead people to. And I think that's a very generative, productive thing coming out of this moment.
Yeah, I think that's so much information. And I think one thing that
I
just stuck
know.
with me is like, or two things really, just in conversation with each other, is like workers need to be like prepared to walk away when like your bottom line isn't met, right? And then also that politicians will catch up. But I know just to like throw it out there was like a case with the railroad workers were,
Yes.
if I remember correctly, they're literally barred from striking. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, what do workers in a situation in which the government has literally said you cannot walk away from this table, like you either take this deal, or like what is their next recourse, or is there one?
Yeah, I mean the rail workers especially are in, like, any of these workers governed under the FLA rather than the NLRA, are, because they're, like, for complex reasons, they are in a bind, and like there have to be ways to get around that. The rail workers themselves have, one, been pushing anyway for certain things that they didn't win at the table, and some of them have won those, like control over scheduling, more sick time, and mandatory like scheduling, things that they wanted. So they kept pushing anyway, right? And they did find ways around it, in part because they had so organized well that everyone was outraged that Biden and other elected officials had shut down their strike. And so they had this kind of public power and organizational kind of momentum to win certain of those things. They've launched a campaign around public ownership of rail. And they're still campaigning on that. They just put out a short documentary about it a couple months ago. And so I certainly wouldn't pretend to know the best strategy forward for workers governed under those provisions. But I think, and I imagine a lot of them would agree. I haven't like run this idea by the rail workers specifically. But, when I was thinking on this past year and doing various reflections on it for different publications, it's like Biden did that. He intervened where he was told not to by the workers, and it was obviously politically wrong. And yet he felt he could get away with that, right? That like, yes, there'd be whining, and yes, certain like annoying labor movement people would say this was betrayal, but who cares about those people? You jump to a few months later, the Teamsters are preparing to shut down and strike UPS, would have been the largest one of the largest strikes in American history, 340,000 people covered by that contract. And Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters, told Biden to stay out of it. Employers were imploring Biden to intervene and stop, in whatever means he could, UPS workers from striking for the sake of the economy. And Biden did not. Like, he stayed out of it, and he listened to Sean O'Brien on that. You cut to 2 months later, Sean Fain and the UAW start wanting to roll EV plants into the big three contracts, because the electric vehicle plants in the US, even where they're operated by the big three automakers, are entirely non-union. And it's a big problem, right? Because that means they are building out a non-union parallel workforce in auto, which only will accelerate the decline of unionization in auto, and the UAW's decline specifically. And, sort of behind the scenes, the UAW folks were like, they asked the Biden administration to have acting labor secretary Julie Su and a US trade rep, ambassador, to sort of help mediate conversations with the big three around how to make that work, how to either get pathways to unionization or roll in those contracts so that EV workers at their plants would have a faster route to unionization. And Biden did that. And so I think you're seeing, even in these small things, and I'm the last to say that Biden is like pro-labor. I think he's just a good politician. And thus it seems meaningful to me that actually he's starting to be a little more afraid of the unions and the workers, and kind of actually follow their lead on what they do and don't want him to do. Which, again, isn't to say I see him as a reliable ally, nor does it mean we don't actually have to reform things so that if rail workers are being worked to death, they can still be barred from fixing that by the state. But it does seem to be like a marker of the direction things are going, and the growing power, organizationally and in the sense of public support, that the working class and unions specifically have now. And we got a long ways to go. But to me, I'm like, if you see Biden as just a fair weather friend and he keeps siding that with you this time, you're like, oh, that's good. It means we are growing. And so I think that is a small positive sign, a tempered sense of optimism here.
Yeah, it's like he's becoming more responsive to the growing power.
Yeah, he's a little scared, which is good.
Exactly. So I know we're running short on time, so I just want to give Dario and Michelle a chance to maybe just give your last recommendations for the labor movement globally, and how they can maybe not use the declaration, but maybe the spirit of these declarations to fight for their rights.
Basically, the spirit of the declaration is to be clear that everything we're asking for in live control of the means of production, the decent salaries, etc. These are all our rights. We're not asking for any favors. We're not like begging for anything. And I think this is one of the most important things. The second thing is, I think, and I think that Michelle made an important point when she pointed out that this is a liberal declaration, and as we know, liberals go always halfway. They tell what they all want, and when they realize what you have to do that, they get back and ally with the right. Yes, because if you read all that, there's one word missing, or one article: abolish capitalism, because you won't have equal pay if there is capitalism. Capitalism has inherently race, class, and gender hierarchies. It needs them. It needs the hierarchies between North and South. It needs to work the hierarchies between different groups that have whatever, different skin color, different religion, different whatever. But like all these hierarchies are inherent part of capitalism. So if you write and want to get this declaration, make it true, it also means you have to say that you have to abolish capitalism. Yes. So this is in the end the last point. And just one sentence, I totally agree that over the past few years we've seen like growing workers' resistance, and I think I use this broader term because it's not just a strike. I mean, here in the US, you had like one of the biggest class uprisings, a black-led class revolt, which was clearly a class thing. There was no doubt about that. Yes, so I think it's important to see that. And just a last thing is just a bit of I don't know if you can even see that. No, I just want to put the image of the book. Is it?
I'll drop a link to it in the chat. I know I can see it like flickering through the green screen thing. Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Dario.
That happened. It's If Not Us, Who? Workers Worldwide Against Authoritarianism, Fascism, and Dictatorship. And it has short chapters of like 6,000, 8,000 words each. So it's also good for, you can download it for free, the PDF, and it has examples from 5 continents. And it's also done specifically, and it's also used in some parts for like workers' trainings and things like that, because it gives you obviously a lot of different situations, strategies, and kind of feeling of empowerment.
Awesome, thank you. And Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe bounce off a bit of what Dario was saying, as we sort of contemplate the legacy of the Universal Declaration, and we're moving towards an increasingly globally integrated economy, it's also important to remember that even as we're discussing worker struggles in the US and the victories that have been achieved and some of the important and exciting organizing that's going on, the US is also sort of part of a broader sort of global economic structure that fundamentally relies on profound global inequality. And so when we were talking about strikes and what different labor unions are doing, I was also thinking about how a lot of the really exciting worker organizing that's happened over the past generation or so has really been led by immigrants, and even the revival of Labor Day in the US, I think is was sort of a migrant-led movement, and often those migrants are working in informal sectors. They don't really have a right to organize under the National Labor Relations Act in terms of forming a formal union, and yet they've found ways to build institutions, to create mutual aid networks, to use and deploy, really innovative technology to communicate with each other and to exercise some kind of voice in the workplace, and even go on strikes as well. So just thinking about the sort of global and the migration aspect of the labor movement, and how the U.S. labor movement is kind of deeply and sort of intricately connected to all these other movements and events and shifts that are happening in other countries. It's interesting to revisit the Universal Declaration in that sense, because it was supposed to be, a global sort of transnational declaration, at least in terms of expressing a general sentiment for what all of humankind should be striving for, right? But it ultimately runs up against, the division between nation states, right? And we're still grappling with how borders have become instruments, have always been sort of instruments of oppression, tools that are used to divide, and really, cuts against this idea of universal rights, right? And it also sort of enforces deep inequalities. And so if we can think of a way around that, and we can also sort of get workers here and over there, and the workers who cross borders, to think about how they're actually, perhaps agents for articulating and implementing sort of a broader, more democratic, more cosmopolitan, more internationalist idea of what rights and humanity, really mean, right? I think like that may be the germ for real change.
That's a really beautiful way to end the conversation. I really want to thank the three of you for being flexible and hopping on. Apologies for my confusing emails and the error in the timing, but you all are amazing for hopping on, and I really think we had a great conversation here on the rights of workers and laborers around the world. So thank you all for joining us, and I think I'll throw it to Esteban. I think Esteban, you're going to Manila next.
Yeah, thank you, Julian, as well. Thank you, and thanks to Mariana as well for all these amazing segments broadcasted from New York.